The Threnody Reach was not a battlefield in the conventional sense, and that was precisely what made it lethal. It was a 40-kilometer corridor of fractured basalt and suspended magnetic ash that the Solhran Concord had cataloged, surveyed, fenced, and then quietly stopped pretending it could ever be tamed. A place where the ground itself had been broken into floating shelves of stone that drifted on slow magnetic tides, where the light came filtered through perpetual dust, the color of old bruises, and where every standard atmospheric reading returned a number that should have been impossible if the corridor obeyed the same physics as the rest of the planet. The Concord's mapping division had assigned it a designation rather than a name, because names implied a relationship, and the corridor had refused every relationship offered to it. It was a line on a chart. It was the place where survey drones went silent within 90 seconds of crossing the boundary marker. It was the test the Concord's elite reconnaissance cadre used to thin their applicant pool, and it had thinned that pool with the patient, indifferent efficiency of a system that not care whether anyone passed at all. To the 7 members of a Talon cohort, it was simply Sector 7, the Deathzone, the place you did not cross unless you wanted the corridor to keep you, and they had spoken of it that way for so many cycles that the words had stopped carrying any meaning beyond ritual. Then the human arrived, and the words began to mean something again. His name was Daniel Reyes, and the Concord's intake file classified him under a category the cadre had never seen applied to an outsider, a category that translated imperfectly into their language as auxiliary technical attachment, provisional, non-combatant. He was not large by the standards of the species that surrounded him. He stood a full head shorter than the smallest of the sorrelkin, and nearly 2 heads shorter than the towering vole who anchored the cohort's heavy support, and his frame, while solid, carried none of the dense, ridged musculature that the Concorde bred into its frontline operators. He did not look like a threat. He did not, the squad leader noted on the first day, look like much of anything, except a man who had spent a long time fixing things that other people had broken and had stopped being surprised by how badly things could break. He carried a worn tool harness instead of a weapon. He asked questions in a flat, mild voice that the translators rendered without inflection, and the questions were never the questions anyone expected. When cohort leader Aventhal informed him on the morning of his attachment that the cadre would be running a full quarter traverse of Sector 7 within the week, and that the human was welcome to wait at the staging post where the bodies of the unsuccessful were usually catalogued, Daniel had listened to the entire briefing with his head slightly tilted, and then he had asked whether there was a scenic route. The translation matrix stalled. Aventhal, who had crossed the Threnody Reach 4 times and lost 3 subordinates doing it, who wore the corridor's survival like a second skeleton, stared at the small human and waited for the matrix to correct itself. It did not correct itself. The human had asked, in apparent sincerity, whether the deadliest 40 kilometers on the planet offered a more pleasant path through it, the way one might ask a transit official about a longer rail line with a better view. For 3 full seconds, absolute silence held in the staging bay, and then Aventhal decided the human was either mocking the cadre or did not understand what he had been told, and in either case, the corridor would resolve the question more honestly than any briefing could. He authorized the attachment. He did not expect the human to survive the first kilometer. To understand why the cadre felt this way, one had to understand what the cadre was. Talon cohort was not a unit in the way a human military used the word. It was a sealed instrument, a 7-bodied apparatus that the Concorde had assembled across 9 cycles of selection and attrition, and each of its members had been chosen for a single irreplaceable function. There was Avon Thal, the leader, a sorrel kin of the high desert lineage whose augmented ocular array could resolve heat differentials across 2 kilometers, and whose voice, when she gave an order, carried the flat finality of someone who had stopped explaining herself a long time ago. There was Korith Vol, the heavy anchor, 3.5 meters of plated muscle whose species had evolved on a world of crushing gravity and who could carry a wounded operator across broken terrain without breaking stride, but whose great weight made the floating basalt shelves a constant gamble. There was the demolition specialist, a narrow, nervous-handed creature of the ISS lineage named Pell, who measured every charge to the milligram, and who regarded any improvised solution as a personal insult to the discipline of controlled detonation. There was the combat medic, a being called Surah, whose 4 delicate manipulator limbs could close a wound in seconds, and whose 2 heavier limbs could break a spine just as fast, a duality that the medic carried without apparent contradiction. There was the corridor guide, Tessine, the only member who had been born on this world and who read the magnetic tides the way other beings read weather, and who had warned the cadre on 3 prior traverses of dangers they had not believed until the dangers arrived. And there was the infiltration specialist, who almost never spoke, whose name in the cadre's records was rendered simply as Vesh, and who watched everything with the patient stillness of a predator that had learned that most prey eliminated itself if you simply waited long enough. Vesh watched the human longest. The cadre's contempt for the attachment was not cruelty, though it wore the shape of cruelty in those first days. It was the logical product of 9 cycles of selection that had taught every member of Talon cohort that the corridor did not forgive softness, and the human was, by every metric the cadre possessed, soft. He could not see in the spectral ranges that mattered. He could not feel the magnetic tides shift beneath the basalt. He could not carry weight, could not move with speed across the unstable shelves, could not survive the corridor's acoustic predators if they found him alone. When Korith Vol spoke of the attachment at all, the heavy anchor spoke of it as ballast, as a thing that would have to be carried or abandoned, and the cadre had quietly agreed among themselves that it would be abandoned. They did not say this to the human. They did not need to. The human, they assumed, could read the assessment in their posture as clearly as they read it in each other. But the human read something else entirely, and what he read, he kept to himself. On the first evening at the staging post, while the cadre performed the ritual maintenance of their gear in the silent, efficient manner of beings who had done it 10,000 times, Daniel Reyes sat apart and disassembled his tool harness piece by piece, cleaning each component with a cloth and laying them out in a precise row on the basalt floor. He did not speak. He did not ask for help, and he did not offer it. He simply worked, with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that the difference between a tool that worked and a tool that failed was almost always a thing too small to see until it killed you. Tessine, the guide, watched him from across the bay with the first flicker of something other than dismissal. The human's hands moved the way her grandmother's hands had moved over the old magnetic compasses before the Concorde's instruments had replaced them. A particular kind of care that could not be taught and could not be faked. She said nothing, but she filed the observation away, the way the cadre filed everything, against the moment it might matter. The traverse began at the boundary marker 3 days later, in the gray hour before the corridor's filter dawn, and the first kilometer killed nothing only because nothing in the first kilometer was trying very hard. The Threnody Reach did not announce its dangers. This was the first thing that any survivor of it learned, and the last thing that any victim of it understood. The corridor was a layered trap in which the obvious threats concealed the real ones, and the cadre had learned to distrust the visible in favor of the felt. The floating basalt shelves drifted on their magnetic tides at speeds that varied with the unseen currents below, and a shelf that was solid footing in one moment could tilt and shear away in the next, dropping an unwary operator into the ash-choked gaps where the acoustic predators waited. Tassine led them across the first field of drifting stone with the fluid certainty of long practice, calling the safe shelves in a low, continuous murmur, and the cadre moved in her wake with the precision of an instrument performing its single function. The human moved at the rear, between Korithfol and the infiltration specialist, and he moved badly. He could not feel the tides. He placed his weight wrong twice in the first 100 meters, and twice Korithvol's massive hand closed on his harness and hauled him back from a shelf that sheared away into the dark a half-second later. The heavy anchor did this without comment, the way one might brush an insect from a surface. And Daniel accepted the corrections without protest, watching the whole time the way Tassine read the stone. By the second kilometer, the human had stopped placing his weight wrong. No one remarked on it. The cadre was occupied with the corridor, and the corridor in the second kilometer had begun to try harder. But Vesh, who watched everything, noted the shift. The human had not been told how to read the tides. He could not feel them. And yet, he had begun to step where Tassine stepped, not by feeling the stone, but by watching the guide's body, by reading the micro-adjustments in her posture a fraction of a second before she made them, by treating her not as a leader to follow, but as an instrument to be calibrated against. It was, Vesh thought, the behavior of something that did not have the sense the corridor required and had decided to build a substitute out of pure observation. The infiltration specialist had hunted many kinds of prey across many worlds. Vesh had never hunted a thing that improvised its own senses on the move. The assessment did not change yet, but it acquired a small footnote, and footnotes, in Vesh's experience, were how the largest reassessments always began. The first real crisis came at the edge of the resonance field, where the corridor narrowed between two cliff faces of crystalline silicate that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of the cadre's hearing. The crystal was beautiful in the filtered light, faceted and pale and shot through with veins of luminous mineral. And it was beautiful in the way that the most dangerous things in the Threnody Reach were always beautiful. The silicate resonated with the magnetic tides, and at certain frequencies, when the tides aligned wrong, the crystal could amplify a sound into a standing wave powerful enough to shatter bone. The cadre knew this. Tassine had timed their approach to cross during a tidal lull, when the resonance would be at its lowest. But the corridor did not honor schedules, and as the cadre entered the narrows, the tide shifted early, and the crystal began to sing. Pell, the demolition specialist, felt it first. A pressure behind the eyes, a vibration in the dense bones of the skull. The narrow creature froze mid-stride on a basalt shelf, and the freezing was the worst possible response because a stationary target gave the standing wave time to build. Tassine called out the lull window, called for speed, and the cadre surged forward across the shelves. But Pell did not move. The demolition specialist had locked, the discipline that made it precise turning against it under the pressure of the rising hum, and in 4 seconds, the resonance would climb past the threshold, and the standing wave would form, and the wave would form precisely where Pell stood. Daniel Reyes did not know any of this in the way the cadre knew it. He could not feel the resonance climbing, but he had been watching Pell, and he had seen the freeze, and he had seen, in the 18 hours since the traverse began, exactly how Pell's mind worked. Because Pell's mind worked the way the minds of careful people always worked, in sequences and checklists and controlled procedures. So the human did not shout at Pell to move, which would have meant nothing. Instead, he crossed 2 shelves and 3 bad steps, reached the frozen specialist, and said, in his flat, mild voice, a single sentence that the translators rendered with perfect clarity over the rising hum. He said that the charge in Pell's left harness pouch was seated wrong and would cook off in the resonance. It was not true. There was nothing wrong with the charge, but it was the one thing in the universe that could break Pell's lock, because it was a problem inside Pell's own discipline, a procedure that needed correcting, and the demolition specialist's hands moved to the pouch on pure trained reflex before the conscious mind had finished processing the words, and the motion broke the freeze, and Daniel's hand closed on Pell's harness and pulled, and the two of them cleared the narrows half a second before the standing wave formed behind them, with a sound like a world cracking. For 3 excruciating seconds, the cadre stood on the far shelves and listened to the crystal sing to an empty space where Pell had been. Then Pell, breathing hard, checked the charge in the left harness pouch and found nothing wrong with it, and understood what the human had done, and said nothing. The demolition specialist was not a creature that thanked anyone, but Pell looked at the small human for a long moment, and the look was no longer the look one gave to ballast. The human had already turned away to check his own harness. This was the pattern that would repeat across the long kilometers of the corridor, though the cadre did not recognize it as a pattern until much later, when the recognizing changed everything. The human did not announce his competence. He did not explain his methods. He simply observed, and where his observation found a problem the cadre had missed, he solved it in the smallest possible way, and returned to his place as though nothing had happened. He performed these solutions the way a person performs the maintenance of a thing they care about, without expectation of acknowledgement, as though the structural integrity of the cadre was simply a law of physics he was obligated to maintain. And slowly, kilometer by kilometer, the cadre's model of the human began to shift, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the patient accumulation of small evidence, the way a magnetic tide shifts, not by any visible motion, but by the slow, inevitable change in everything it touches. At the 8th kilometer, they made camp in the lee of a stone shelf large enough to be stable, and the cold came down with the dark. The Threnody reach grew bitterly cold at night, a cold that the cadre's bodies, bred for harsher worlds, endured without complaint but never welcomed, and the protocol on a traverse was to endure it in silence because heat sources drew the acoustic predators, and warmth was a luxury the corridor did not permit. The cadre arranged themselves in the cold and prepared to wait out the dark, and the human, working quietly in the corner of the shelf with the components of his disassembled tool harness, built something. It was not a fire. He understood by then that a fire would draw the predators, and he had no intention of killing the cadre to keep them warm. What he built instead was a small contained heat exchanger, fashioned from the casing of a depleted power cell, the resonance dampener from his harness, and a length of conductive wire, a device that drew the residual charge from the cadre's spent equipment cells and converted it to a low radiant warmth contained within a baffle that emitted no sound and almost no light. He set it in the center of the sheltered space, without a word. Then he returned to his corner and went still. The cadre regarded the small, warm device with the suspicion they regarded everything the human did. Korith Vol, who felt the cold least, ignored it. Pell studied it with the professional interest of one specialist examining another's improvised work and found, grudgingly, that it was elegant. But it was Sura, the medic, who broke first, because Sura's delicate manipulator limbs had been growing stiff in the cold, and a stiff-handed medic was a liability the cadre could not afford. And so, the medic edged closer to the warmth and warmed its hands and said nothing. Then Tessin. Then, after a long while, even Aventhal, the leader, settled within the radius of the small warmth, and the cadre passed the cold hours of the corridor's deepest dark, gathered around a thing the human had built for them, and asked nothing in return. No one spoke of it. No one thanked him. But in the morning, when the cadre broke camp, Korith Vol picked up the small heat exchanger and stowed it carefully in the heavy anchor's own pack and carried it for the rest of the traverse. And this was the first time in the cadre's 9 cycles that any member had voluntarily carried a thing that belonged to the attachment. The human watched the heavy anchor stow the device and did not comment, and the cadre moved on into the 9th kilometer. What the cadre did not know, what only the corridor and a small number of officers in the Concorde's logistics command knew, was that the traverse had never been a test. It had been an erasure. Even Thal had been told, in a private communication she had not shared with her cohort, that the human attachment carried a logistics audit authorization, that the man whose file read auxiliary technical attachment, provisional, non-combatant, had in fact been routed to Talon cohort by a division of the Concorde's Oversight Bureau that suspected the corridor's mapping division of a long-running fraud. The survey drones that went silent within 90 seconds of crossing the boundary marker had not all been destroyed by the corridor. Some of them had been recalled quietly by a mapping officer named Castellan Orveth, who had spent 6 cycles selling the corridor's supposed impassibility to the Concorde's Military Procurement Bureau, drawing funds for survey equipment that was never deployed, for hazard pay that was never earned, for a fortified staging infrastructure that existed mostly on paper. The corridor was dangerous, but it was not as dangerous as Orveth had made it appear, and the difference between the real danger and the manufactured danger was a sum of misappropriated funds large enough to end the careers of everyone who had signed the false reports. And Daniel Reyes, the small, soft human who asked about the Scenic route, had been sent into the Threnody Reach to confirm what the corridor actually was, which meant that Orveth needed him not to come back. Avon Thal had been given a choice she did not recognize as a choice. The orders that routed the human into her cohort had come with a quiet attachment, a suggestion phrased in the bloodless language of the Bureau that the attrition rate of the corridor was well documented and that no one would question the loss of a non-combatant on a traverse of Sector 7. She had understood the suggestion. She had not yet decided what to do with it. And as the cadre crossed into the most dangerous stretch of the corridor, the leader of Talon cohort carried the weight of an order she had not been given in words, an order to let the corridor do what orders could not be written to demand, and she found, to her own surprise, that the order had begun to sit wrong against the evidence her own eyes had gathered across 9 kilometers of broken stone. Because the human kept being right. At the 10th kilometer, Tessin led them toward a crossing the guide had used on every prior traverse, a wide, stable land bridge of fused basalt that spanned a gap too broad for the floating shelves, and the human stopped at the edge of it and would not cross. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply crouched at the lip of the land bridge and looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at the gap below. And then he asked Tessine, in his flat, mild voice, when the guide had last crossed this bridge. Tessine answered, "The previous traverse, 2 cycles ago." The human asked whether the bridge had looked the same then. Tessine, who read the corridor better than any living being, said that it had, and the human pointed to a hairline seam in the fused basalt, a crack so fine that it disappeared at the edges of vision, running the full width of the bridge, 1/3 of the way across. And he said that the bridge had begun to delaminate, that the magnetic tides had been working the seam for 2 cycles, and that the next significant load would drop the far 2/3 of it into the gap. The cadre did not believe him. The bridge had held 4 9 cycles. It was the safest crossing in the corridor. Tessine, whose pride was bound up in knowing the corridor, felt the human's words as a challenge to the one thing the guide possessed, and for a moment, the old contempt returned. But Avon Thal, whose augmented ocular array could resolve heat differentials across 2 kilometers, focused that array on the hairline seam the human had indicated, and saw in the spectral ranges the human could not perceive a thin ribbon of differential heat where friction between the delaminating layers had been generating warmth for a very long time. The leader said nothing for a moment. Then she ordered the cadre to find another crossing. They found one, a slower, harder route, across the floating shelves that cost them 3 hours, and as the last of them cleared the gap, a tidal surge ran through the corridor, and the land bridge, under no load at all, sheared along the hairline seam and dropped its far 2/3 into the dark with a sound that went on for a very long time. Tessine looked at the place where the bridge had been. Then the guide looked at the human, and the guide's posture had changed, the particular stiffness of wounded pride replaced by something the cadre rarely showed to anyone outside itself. Tessine asked the human how he had known, and Daniel Reyes, who had not bragged once in 10 kilometers, answered in the same flat, mild voice he used for everything, and what he said was not a boast, but a fragment of a life. He said that he had grown up in a place where the work was salvage, where families made their living, pulling apart the things that larger and richer worlds had thrown away, and that you learned doing that work to see the way a thing was going to fail before it failed, because the alternative was to be standing on the thing when it failed, and the people who did not learn to see it did not get old. He said it the way one might describe the weather. Then he shouldered his harness and waited for Tessine to find the next safe shelf, and the matter was closed. But it was not closed inside the cadre. The reassessment that had begun as a footnote in Vesch's patient observation had spread by the 10th kilometer through the whole instrument of Tallinn cohort, and each member had arrived at it by a different road. Pell had arrived at it in the resonance field, when the human broke a lock that should not have been breakable. Seurat had arrived at it around the small warmth in the dark. Tessine had arrived at it at the edge of a bridge that fell. Korithfol had arrived at it carrying a device the heavy anchor had no reason to carry, and Aventhal had arrived at it slowly, against the weight of an order she had not been given in words, watching a non-combatant be correct about the corridor more often than her own specialists, until the leader of the cadre understood, with the cold clarity of her trade, that the human she had been quietly told to abandon was the single most valuable instrument on the traverse, and that someone in the Concord had wanted him dead badly enough to route him into a death zone to accomplish it. She did not yet know why. But she had begun to want to know. Only Vesh had not yet fully reassessed, and Vesh was the one whose reassessment would matter most, because the infiltration specialist's acceptance was the cadre's last and highest gate. Vesh had watched the human break Pell's lock and build the warmth and read the bridge, and Vesh had filed each event, and Vesh had reached a conclusion that the others had not reached because the others did not think the way a hunter thinks. The human was not lucky. The human was not merely observant. The human had, in 18 hours, learned to read every member of the cadre well enough to manipulate Pell's discipline, to predict Tassine's pride, to know exactly which lever in each mind would produce the response the situation required, and he had done it so quietly that none of them had noticed they were being read. To Vesh, this was not comforting. This was the most dangerous thing the infiltration specialist had ever encountered, because Vesh's entire function was to be the one who read others without being read, and the small, soft human had been doing to the whole cadre, casually, instinctively, what Vesh did to enemies as a trained and deliberate art. Vesh's assessment of the human shifted at the 10th kilometer from soft prey to something the specialist had no prior category for, a thing that was harmless in every visible dimension and catastrophic in the one dimension that could not be seen. Vesh did not warm to the human. Vesh did the opposite. Vesh began, for the first time in many cycles, to be careful. The crisis that would decide everything came at the 12th kilometer, in the place the cadre called the choir. The choir was the deepest part of the Threnody Reach, a vast natural amphitheater where the crystalline silicate that hummed in the narrows reached its full and terrible development, where entire cliff faces of the resonant mineral rose hundreds of meters on every side, and where the magnetic tides, funneled and concentrated by the bowl of the terrain, ran faster and shifted harder than anywhere else in the corridor. The cadre had to cross the floor of the choir, a treacherous field of the largest and least stable floating shelves in the Reach, and they had to do it during a tidal alignment narrow enough that Tassine had timed their entire traverse around reaching it at the correct hour. They reached it at the correct hour. They began the crossing, and a third of the way across, the alignment failed. It failed because it had been made to fail. The tidal alignment Tassine had timed against was governed by a network of magnetic resonance beacons that the Concorde's mapping division had seeded across the corridor cycles ago, beacons that allowed a trained guide to predict the tides, and one of those beacons, the one that governed the choir, had been moved, not destroyed. Moved a precise 40 meters from its charted position, far enough to throw Tassine's calculation off by the small margin that, in the choir, was the difference between a crossing and a grave. The human had noticed the beacon was wrong 2 kilometers earlier and had said nothing, because he had not yet understood what it meant. And now, in the center of the choir, with the tide turning wrong beneath the largest shelves in the corridor, the meaning arrived for everyone at once. The shelf beneath Korithvol tilted. The heavy anchor weighed more than any 2 other members of the cadre combined, and the corridor had always made the heavy anchor's weight a gamble. And now, the gamble came due. The shelf sheared and tilted and began to drop, and Korithvol, 3.5 meters of plated muscle, slid toward the ash-choked gap where the acoustic predators waited, and there was no shelf below to catch the heavy anchor, and no member of the cadre strong enough to arrest that mass in motion. Sura lunged and could not reach. Tassine called a route that did not exist. The crystal of the choir, feeling the failed alignment, began to sing, the standing waves building in the great bowl with a power that dwarfed anything in the narrows. In 10 seconds, the heavy anchor would be in the gap. In 15, the choir would reach full resonance and the standing waves would shatter every unprotected body on the floor of the amphitheater. The cadre's training, 9 cycles of it, offered no solution because the cadre's training had never accounted for the heavy anchor falling where no one could catch it. Daniel Reyes had accounted for it because Daniel Reyes had spent his life pulling apart the things larger worlds had thrown away, and he knew something about mass and magnetism and salvage that the cadre's specialists, for all their bred and trained excellence, had never needed to learn. He did not try to catch Korith Vol. He could not have. The human weighed a fraction of what the heavy anchor weighed. Instead, he did the thing that the resonance dampener in his harness had been built for, the thing he had used to make the warmth in the dark, the thing his whole life had taught him. He pulled the dampener and the length of conductive wire from his harness in a single motion, and he did not aim it at Korith Vol. He aimed it at the falling shelf. The shelves of the Threnody Reach floated on magnetic tides, which meant the shelves themselves were magnetically responsive, which meant a shelf was not a falling rock, but a falling magnet. And a falling magnet could be caught, briefly, by another magnetic field if you knew exactly where to apply it. The human cracked the dampener's casing, reversed the polarity the way he had reversed it 10,000 times, salvaging dead cells from broken machines, and grounded it against the resonant crystal of the nearest cliff face, which was saturated with the corridor's own magnetic field. And for 1/2 second, the falling shelf and the singing cliff repelled each other hard enough to arrest the shelf's drop, hard enough to tilt it back a few critical degrees, hard enough that Korith Vol, sliding, caught the lip of a neighboring stable shelf with one massive plated hand and held. The dampener cooked off in the human's hands in a flash of dead light. The 1/2 second ended. The shelf resumed its fall into the dark, but the heavy anchor was no longer on it. Korith Vol hauled 3.5 meters of body up onto stable stone with the desperate strength of a creature bred on a crushing world, and the cadre, moving now with the failed alignment forgotten in the singular focus of survival, cleared the floor of the choir in the narrowing window before the standing waves reached full power, dragging the human with them, and they came out the far side onto solid ground as the choir behind them rose to a scream that would have shattered every one of them to powder. For a long moment, on the solid ground beyond the choir, no one moved and no one spoke. Korith Vol looked at his own plated hand, the hand that had caught the lip of the shelf. And then the heavy anchor looked at the small human who was shaking his burned fingers and examining the ruined casing of the dampener with an expression of mild, professional annoyance, as though the device's destruction were a greater concern than the life it had saved. Korith Vol did not have words for what had happened. The heavy anchor species did not value words, but Korith Vol crossed the solid ground to where the human stood and reached into the heavy anchor's own pack and withdrew the small heat exchanger the human had built in the dark, the device Korith Vol had carried for kilometers, and held it out to the human in one enormous plated hand, an offering, a return, a thing passed from the cadre to the attachment without a single word spoken. And Daniel Reyes looked at the small, warm device in the heavy anchor's hand and understood what was being offered, and took it, and that was all. No speech, no declaration. A device passed from one hand to another on solid ground beyond a place that should have killed them all. Vesh watched the exchange, and Vesh's long reassessment completed itself, and what completed it was not the human's competence, which Vesh had already catalogued, but the human's restraint. The human had just done a thing that no member of the cadre could have done, had just saved the heavy anchor with a technique none of the specialists possessed. And the human had not turned to the cadre afterward with any expectation, had not demanded acknowledgement, had not even seemed to register that he had done anything remarkable. He had been annoyed about a broken tool. To Vesh, who understood power and the hunger for it better than any other being in the cadre, this was the final and decisive piece of evidence. Because Vesh had learned across many cycles that the only beings who did not perform their power were the ones who had so much of it that performance was beneath them, or the ones who had never thought of their capability as power at all. The human was the second kind. And the second kind, Vesh understood, was the kind you wanted beside you rather than across from you, because the second kind did not keep score. And a being that did not keep score could not be predicted by the calculus of self-interest that governed everyone else. Vesh crossed to where the human stood, and the infiltration specialist, who almost never spoke, spoke. Vesh asked the human a single question. Vesh asked who had moved the beacon, and Danielle Reyes, who had noticed the moved beacon 2 kilometers before the choir, who had spent the long crossing assembling the pieces of a thing he had not wanted to believe, told the cadre what he had come into the corridor to find out, and what the corridor had nearly killed all of them to keep hidden. He told them about the audit. He told them about the recalled drones and the manufactured danger and the misappropriated funds, about a mapping officer who had built 6 cycles of career and comfort on the lie that the 3-node reach was impassable, and who had needed the human dead to keep the lie alive. He told them, in his flat, mild voice, that the moved beacon had not been an accident of the corridor, but an act of murder aimed at all of them, because Castellan Orveth could not have the human die alone in a way that might be investigated. And so Orveth had arranged for the human to die with the whole cadre, an entire elite reconnaissance unit lost to the corridor's documented dangers, a tragedy too large and too plausible to question. The human laid it out the way he laid out everything, without heat, without accusation, a salvage operator describing the way a thing had been engineered to fail. And when he finished, the cadre understood that the order Eventhal had carried unspoken since the staging post, the suggestion that no one would question the laws of a non-combatant, had been the visible edge of a far larger machine, and that they themselves had been the disposable part of it all along. Eventhal stood very still while the human spoke, and when he finished, the leader of Talon cohort understood the full shape of what she had nearly done. She had been told to let the corridor take a non-combatant. She had not been told that letting it happen would have meant her own death and the death of her entire cohort, because Orveth had never intended for any witness to survive. The leader who had quietly agreed that the attachment would be abandoned now understood that the attachment was the only reason the cadre had crossed the choir alive, and that the system she had served for 9 cycles had marked her and her cohort for erasure with the same indifference it had marked the human. Eventhal did not give a speech. The leader of the cadre was not a creature of speeches, but she opened a secure channel to the Concord's Oversight Bureau, the bureau that had routed the human into her cohort, and she logged a single transmission, a full sensor record of the moved beacon, and a formal statement that Talon cohort would be completing the corridor traverse and returning the auxiliary technical attachment to the staging post alive. And she let the implication of that statement carry the rest. The machine that had wanted the human dead would learn from her transmission that the machine had failed, and that an elite reconnaissance cadre now knew exactly why it had been sent to die. The remaining kilometers of the Threnody Reach passed without incident, which was its own kind of strange after everything, the corridor settling back into its ordinary lethal indifference as though it had spent its malice and had nothing left but the baseline danger it had always carried. The cadre crossed the last fields of floating stone with the human in the center of the formation now, rather than at the rear, a position that no one had ordered and no one remarked upon. The small, soft attachment moved without comment to the place the cadre reserved for the members it could not afford to lose. Tessin called the safe shelves. Korith Vol walked beside the human across the unstable ground, and twice, when the human placed his weight wrong, the heavy anchor's hand was already there, not hauling him back like ballast now, but steadying him like a member, a difference too small to measure and too large to miss. They reached the far boundary marker in the gray hour before the corridors filtered dawn, the same hour they had entered, and they stepped out of Sector 7 onto the unbroken ground of the world beyond it. And the Deathzone, which had been crossed, did not keep them. The resolution of Castellan Orveth's fraud occurred elsewhere, and, at another time, in the bloodless proceedings of the Concord's Oversight Bureau, far from the corridor and far from the cadre. And the cadre took no part in it beyond the censor record even Thal had transmitted from beyond the choir. The cadre did not see Orveth's career end. The cadre did not need to. That was a different machine resolving a different thing, and the cadre had learned, in the corridor, that the things that mattered were not the large resolutions that happened far away, but the small ones that happened close. At the staging post on the morning after the traverse, while the cadre performed the ritual maintenance of their gear in the silent, efficient manner of beings who had done it 10,000 times, Daniel Reyes sat apart and disassembled his tool harness piece by piece, as he had on the first evening, cleaning each component and laying them out in a precise row on the basalt floor. But the small heat exchanger he had built in the dark was no longer among his components, because the heat exchanger was in Korith Vol's pack still, where the heavy anchor had returned it after returning it, having decided, in the wordless arithmetic of the cadre, that the device belonged with the cohort now, and that the cohort included the human. And as the human worked, Vesh crossed the staging bay, the infiltration specialist who almost never spoke and who had watched the human longest, and Vesh sat down on the basalt floor across from the human, within arm's reach, in the open, in a posture the specialist had never once adopted, near an outsider, a posture that said, in the only language Vesh trusted, that the watching was over. Vesh did not speak. The human did not speak. The two of them sat in the gray light of the staging bay, the hunter and the thing the hunter had no category for, and the human passed Vesh a cleaning cloth without being asked, and Vesh took it and began to clean a weapon that did not need cleaning, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of a predator waiting for prey to eliminate itself. It was the silence of two members of the same instrument, sitting in the cold, doing the small, careful work that the difference between living and dying always came down to. And outside the bay, the Threnody Reach drifted on its slow magnetic tides and waited, with patient indifference, for someone else to come and ask it about the scenic route.